Hi, and welcome to As for Science. The human brain is the most complex structure of the known universe. It contains no less than 75 billion neurons, which is 10 times more than the number of people on Earth. But what will happen if we used 100% of our brain? Well, let's answer that with another question. If we only use 10% of our brain, what is that 10%? Given the extreme complexity of the human brain, it has been difficult to divide it according to its structure and functions. Starting with large divisions, these are divided into subregions that are also divided at the same time, and so on. So it would take hours to explain each one of them. To simplify the explanation, we will focus on the cerebral cortex. It's the outermost layer of nervous tissue of the brain that in this image would correspond to the darkest purple. Our brain consumes on average about 20 watts of energy, which is more or less the same energy consumed by a conventional light bulb. It is little, but it's enough so that through techniques such as magnetic resonance imaging, it has been possible to detect its energy consumption, so we could establish that areas of the brain function according to what a person is doing at a given moment. This has led to the division of the cortex into different zones, which are the following: the visual cortex, visual association area, somatic sensory association area, primary sensory cortex, primary motor cortex, somatic motor association area, prefrontal cortex, Broca's area, auditory association area, auditory cortex, and Wernicke's area. Right now, to watch this video, you're using more than half of these parts. So you're actually using well over 10% of your cerebral cortex. But you'll say, hadn't you told us before that the cerebral cortex only represents a very small part of the brain? So in reality, on a global level, we only use 10% of the brain? Well, no, because the other parts of the brain that I have not mentioned are also just as important, and we're also using them. We don't use our brain at 100% at a given moment, but throughout the day, surely you use all the parts. Well, okay, but what if we really do use all the parts of our brain, but they only work at 10% of their power or capacity? Well, neither, because it wouldn't be biologically possible to maintain a structure so large that only works at 10% of its capacity. A clear example that the brain is already at its peak is the case of Stephen Wiltshire, a British artist with a special talent. He's able to draw gigantic realistic representations of cities that he has only briefly observed. He draws them exactly and with an overwhelming level of detail. Just a helicopter flight enjoying the views have been enough for Stephen to draw from memory a gigantic panorama of the city of Singapore. The panorama has been made to scale, drawn by hand with a fine marker, and in just 5 days. We could think that Stephen does use his brain at 100% of its power, and it's really like that. He uses his brain at 100% of its power. Like you. We all use our brain at 100% of its power. What happens is that in Stephen's case, his brain preferred to enhance certain areas of it to the detriment of others. As a child, Stephen did not relate to people normally, and his parents thought that he was mute. At the age of 3, his parents decided to take him to the doctor, and after a series of tests, he was diagnosed as autistic. From then on, he received specialized attention, and at the age of 9, he learned to speak. Until that age, drawing was his only way of communicating with others. His autism is his face and tails. For one part, it does not allow him to relate to the world normally, but at the same time, it is his gift, which allows him to draw in a special and incredible way. Stephen's case is incredible proof that our brain already works at 100% of its power, since if the brain wants to enhance any of its parts, as it is already at its peak and can no longer do so, it has to sacrifice power in one of other areas. So, as in the case of Stephen, he knows how to draw very well, but he has certain problems in relating. Our brain is very powerful. Without going any further, it uses no less than 20% of all the oxygen in our body. This is a lot. But how powerful is it? Well, compared to current computers, our brain is much more advanced. At the age of 20, a person has about 160,000 kilometers of connections in his brain, more or less half the distance between the Earth and the Moon, and with transmission speeds that can reach 432 kilometers per hour. Whoa! In 2013, a team of researchers used the Fujitsu K computer, one of the most powerful supercomputers in the world, to compare the brain and computers. It took 40 minutes using 82,944 processors to process what our brain processes in 1 second. And in case this doesn't surprise you, think that this computer used 10 million watts when you only use 20. Fascinating. Now that we're comparing, how much information fits in your brain? Well, studies have been done that have estimated that approximately 1,000 terabytes can fit. It's amazing. But speaking of information, right now, how much information is passing from your eyes to your brain? The University of Pennsylvania did a study on the matter where it was found that the human retina transmits information at 10 million bytes per second, which is about 9 gigabytes per second, approximately the same speed at which data circulates through Ethernet, a communication system between computing devices that differs from the internet by being a local network. Obviously, not everything that you see is stored in your brain, otherwise your memory would run out in a very short time. But fortunately, we have our imagination that allows us, based on some images, to create our own worlds. But what would happen if we didn't have imagination? Aphantasia is a hypothetical neurological condition in which people who suffer from it cannot imagine anything. It sounds difficult for a person who can imagine to imagine that a person cannot imagine anything, but vice versa is also quite complicated. Until this condition was described, some people with aphantasia simply thought that when someone told them that they could see an object, place, or person in their mind, it was simply as a way of speaking, a metaphor. Currently, little is known about this disease, if it can be called that. And I said that maybe it's not a disease because we will never be sure if what happens in our mind is normal or not. We normally assume that the people around us experience the world in the same way as we do. But conditions such as aphantasia make us wonder if it's really the case. Who knows how different we can really be? Is the color red that you see the same as what I see? Maybe your experience of red is my experience of blue. Who knows? This is a topic that gives a lot to think about. It's very philosophical. But really, what is thinking? I mean, when we think, whose voice is that we hear? Read this word mentally. Whose voice is that you just heard in your head? Researcher Mark Scott from the University of British Columbia found evidence that the brain signal called corollary discharge, which is the signal that helps us distinguish sensory experiences we produced ourselves from those that come from external stimuli, plays a very important role in our internal voice. The corollary discharge is a kind of signal that the brain generates and helps us to explain, for example, why we feel tickles when others itch us, but we cannot tickle ourselves. The signal predicts our own movements and effectively cancels the tickling sensation. This same mechanism participates in the processing of speech in the auditory system. When we speak, an internal copy of the sound of our voice is generated in parallel with the sound we hear. The researcher's theory is that the internal copy of our voice produced by the corollary discharge is generated even when there is no external sound, which means that the sound we hear when we speak internally is, in reality, the prediction of the sound of our own voice. But if in order to think, we need to know what our own voice is like and know how to speak, how do deaf people think? Well, although it seems incredible, they think in sign language. They imagine themselves in their brain. They feel themselves in their brain, making signs. Seems somewhat extravagant, something difficult to understand, but it's their only way to do it. Because cases of deaf people have been found that during their childhood they never received training about how to do sign language. So they seemed like disabled people. They were diagnosed as mentally retarded. And it's normal because they couldn't think. But when they were taught sign language, they became normal people. It's something amazing. And I propose an experiment. Try to think without using words, without using language. It is impossible. You can imagine things, you can imagine images and scenes, but thinking, properly speaking, is impossible. This shows that language is something basic to be able to have structures in our mind. Without it, our brain cannot function at 100%. So in a certain way, we could say that we are what we are, thanks to language. Although in any case, we will never be sure if we perceive reality the same way our friends do. But what we can be sure of is that we use 100% of our brain, the most complex structure in the universe. And it's not surprising, since it contains more connections than 3 billion times the number of stars in the Milky Way. It's amazing, but the most important thing is to make good use of it. Thank you very much for watching the video, and goodbye.